I'm Alyssa, 30F, and I have a younger brother, Ethan, 26M. We've never really gotten along, and after what happened recently, I don't think we ever will. Ethan's always had a problem with the fact that I've done well in life, and he decided to take it out on me in a very public way. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well for him. Our strained relationship started when we were kids. My parents, for reasons I still don't fully understand, always treated Ethan like he was something special. Before he was born, they doted on me. I was their world. But after he came along, everything changed. Suddenly, I wasn't the star anymore. No matter how hard I tried to impress them, whether it was excelling in school, sports, or performing in school plays, nothing worked. My parents' attention was glued to Ethan, even though, from my perspective, he wasn't exactly doing anything exceptional to deserve it. If Ethan had been some kind of prodigy, I might have understood their favoritism, but he wasn't. He was just a regular kid who frankly was a bit of a brat. And worse, he knew how to manipulate our parents into always focusing on him. Every time I had a reason to celebrate, a good grade, an award, anything, he'd find a way to steal the spotlight. My parents, blinded by their favoritism, let him do it every single time. One of the most vivid examples of this was my 18th birthday. My parents had thrown a party for me, but in the middle of it, we got a call from the police. Apparently, Ethan had been caught drinking with friends. What really pissed me off was that all his friends ran, but he stayed behind, almost like he wanted to get caught. And of course, he succeeded in shifting all the attention onto himself. My parents rushed to pick him up from the police station, and when they got back, the focus wasn't on my birthday anymore. It was on him. To make matters worse, he didn't even face any real consequences. My dad's connections in law enforcement got him off with just a warning. It wasn't the first time he'd ruined something important to me, and it wasn't the last either. When I landed my first job at 21, I thought, finally, something that's mine. But Ethan swooped in again, announcing that he'd gotten engaged. Once again, my moment was overshadowed. My parents, predictably, turned their attention to celebrating his engagement instead of my new career. That was the final straw for me. I snapped. We had a huge argument, me, Ethan, and my parents. And when they refused to see my side, I cut them out of my life completely. It's been 9 years since I last spoke to my parents or my brother. They've tried to reach out a few times, but I've ignored every attempt. I know deep down that if I let them back in, it'll just be the same thing all over again. Ethan would still be the golden child, and I'd still be an afterthought. So I focused on myself. I built a life that I'm proud of. I run my own business now, and 2 years ago, when things really started to take off, I bought myself a beautiful new house. My life was going well, I didn't need them. But then, 6 days ago, Ethan showed up again, not in person, but in the form of vandalism. I'd just gotten home from work and was getting ready to head out to a party. Since I was in a rush, I hadn't parked my car in the garage. When I stepped outside to leave, I saw it. Blood-red spray paint covering my car. There were curse words scrawled on the sides, but the worst part was what was written on the windshield. "You don't deserve any of this, Dot." For a few moments I was frozen in shock. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It didn't take long for me to piece together who had done it. The handwriting was familiar, and my brother's petty jealousy had been simmering for years. Just to be sure, I checked my security cameras, and there it was. Ethan, in a hoodie, but still recognizable. He hadn't even been careful enough to hide his face properly. I knew calling the cops would be useless. My dad would just pull some strings and Ethan would get off with another slap on the wrist. But I wasn't about to let him get away with it this time. After thinking about it for a while, I came up with an idea that I knew would hit him where it hurt. I posted the security footage and photos of my car on social media. I didn't hold back. I told everyone exactly who had done it and why. The response was immediate. Comments flooded in from family members, friends, and even acquaintances. I'd made sure to unblock my family members so they could see it all. Within a few hours, the post had blown up, and it wasn't long before Ethan texted me, begging me to take it down. But I wasn't about to let him off that easily. He wanted me to remove the post, but I knew that if he tried to take legal action, it would backfire on him. He'd have to prove in court that it wasn't him in the video, and there was no way he could do that. I had him cornered, and for once, he was the one feeling the consequences of his actions. He kept messaging me, offering to pay for the damage to my car if I'd just delete the post. But it wasn't about the money for me. I wanted something more. I wanted a public apology. Only then would I consider taking the post down. Naturally, he refused. He couldn't admit what he'd done publicly without risking everything. He'd always been good at hiding his bad behavior behind our parents. But now the whole world knew the truth. As the days passed, my parents got involved. They called, demanding that I take the post down, claiming that it was hurting my dad's reputation. My mom even cried, trying to guilt me into forgiving them, but I wasn't moved. I told them the post would stay up until Ethan apologized publicly. They tried to make excuses, saying they had changed and that they'd cut Ethan off after learning the truth. But it didn't matter to me. I wasn't going to back down. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being pushed aside. Ethan had to face the consequences, and I wasn't going to let him wriggle out of it this time. It didn't take long after posting that video for things to get messy. My phone started blowing up with messages, mostly from people who couldn't believe what Ethan had done. The comments were a mix of outrage and disbelief, especially from people who knew him growing up. But the funniest part? My parents weren't prepared for the fallout. They'd always protected Ethan, so I guess they thought they could keep covering up his mistakes forever. Not this time. 2 days after the post went live, Ethan finally caved. He texted me, saying he was willing to pay for the damage to my car, but he just wanted me to take the post down. I could practically hear the desperation in his words, but I told him again that it wasn't about the money. I wanted a public apology, plain and simple. He tried to argue, saying that a public apology would ruin him, that he'd lose all his clients. What clients, though? I knew for a fact he didn't have a job. He'd been living off our parents' support ever since his business failed. And even then, it wasn't like he was doing anything productive with his life. After I refused to take down the post, Ethan's tone changed. He started pleading with me, saying he'd apologize privately or in person, but just not online. He couldn't risk it. I didn't care. The whole reason I put the post up was to expose him and the way my parents had been enabling his behavior for years. If I let him get away with a private apology, it would be like giving him another free pass. I wasn't about to let that happen. Soon after, my parents got involved. First, it was my mom calling me in tears, asking me to take the post down for the sake of the family. She said it was ruining my dad's reputation and that he'd spent his whole life serving the community as a police officer. I could hear the guilt in her voice, but I wasn't falling for it. They should have thought about all of this before they let Ethan run wild, knowing he could always rely on them to clean up his messes. My dad called next, and the conversation went pretty much the same way. He didn't cry, though. He was angry. He said the post was embarrassing him and that it wasn't just hurting Ethan. It was damaging his career. I had to remind him that he'd retired a few months ago. Sure, he still had connections on the force, but it wasn't like he had a job to lose. If anything, this was just about him trying to protect his precious son, like always. When my dad started raising his voice, accusing me of being selfish and letting success go to my head, I realized nothing had changed. They hadn't cut Ethan off like they said they did. They were still doing everything they could to shield him from the consequences of his actions. That's when I knew I was doing the right thing by keeping the post up. As the conversation dragged on, my mom broke down, admitting that they had treated Ethan and me differently growing up. But she tried to spin it, saying that they'd been reaching out to me for years, trying to make amends, and I was the one who refused to respond. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony of it all. Suddenly, I was the bad guy for not letting them waltz back into my life after years of being cast aside. I told her that if they really wanted to make things right, they should have done it a long time ago. What really pissed me off, though, was when she mentioned they'd only been talking to Ethan to convince him to come clean about the vandalism. Apparently, after the post went live and people started asking questions, he finally admitted to them that it was him. But instead of making him apologize, they were trying to get me to delete the post so the whole thing would blow over. It was the same story all over again. Protect Ethan, no matter what. At that point, I told them I was done with the conversation. I wasn't taking the post down, and they could either convince Ethan to apologize publicly or leave me alone. I hung up on them, feeling both angry and exhausted. It was always the same. No accountability, no consequences, and I wasn't about to let them keep walking all over me, especially not now that I'd finally taken control of my own life. The next few days were quiet. I didn't hear anything from Ethan or my parents, and I thought maybe they'd finally realized I wasn't going to back down. But then, out of nowhere, Ethan texted me again. This time, he wasn't just offering to pay for the car repairs, he was offering more money than the damage had even cost. That's when it clicked. He wasn't getting this money from some legit job. He had to be involved in something shady. There was no way he had that kind of cash without a job or a stable income. I didn't reply to his messages. There was no point. I wasn't going to negotiate with him. The only thing I wanted was that public apology, and I wasn't going to settle for anything less. Every time he texted me, I just ignored him, and eventually he gave up. Then my dad called again. This time he wasn't asking. He was demanding that I take the post down. He said that if I didn't, they'd have no choice but to take legal action. I couldn't believe it. After everything Ethan had done, I was the one being threatened with a lawsuit. I told my dad that if they wanted to go down that road, they were more than welcome to. I wasn't scared of a defamation case because, in the end, the truth was on my side. The footage was there, clear as day. Ethan couldn't deny it, and my dad knew that. That's when my dad lost it. He started yelling, saying I was letting my success get to my head and that I thought I was untouchable now that I had money and status. He accused me of being ungrateful and of not appreciating the fact that they'd tried to reach out to me all these years. I just stood there, listening to him rant, feeling more and more disconnected from the family I once knew. It was like they were incapable of seeing the truth that Ethan wasn't the victim here. He was the one who had vandalized my car. He was the one who refused to take responsibility for his actions. When my dad started to get personal, making jabs at my life choices and accusing me of abandoning the family, I had enough. I told him, plain and simple, that I wasn't taking the post down, and if they wanted to sue me, I'd be ready. I hung up the phone, shaking with anger. How could they still not see how wrong they were? How could they be so blind to the damage they'd done? A few days passed, and then my parents showed up at my house with a lawyer. It was a Saturday morning. I was at home relaxing when I saw them standing outside. I invited them in, mostly because I was curious about what they had to say. My mom, dad, and our family lawyer, who also happens to be my uncle. They didn't waste any time getting to the point. My dad said that if I didn't take the post down, they'd be forced to file a defamation lawsuit against me. My uncle even showed me the paperwork, as if I was supposed to be intimidated by it. But honestly, I wasn't scared. I found the whole situation kind of amusing. They seemed shocked that I didn't immediately cave. I told them that if they wanted to sue me, they could go ahead. I had no intention of backing down. At this point, I was so fed up with their attempts to control the narrative that I wasn't willing to give them an inch. My dad, of course, tried to push the issue. He slammed his fist on my coffee table, yelling about how serious this was and how they were giving me a chance to avoid all this legal trouble if I just took the post down. But I wasn't intimidated. I calmly told him that they needed to leave. If they wanted to pursue legal action, they were free to do so. But I wasn't going to be bullied into taking the post down without a public apology from Ethan. When my dad refused to leave, my patience wore thin. I told them firmly that if they didn't go, I'd have to call the police. It wasn't an empty threat. I was ready to take this as far as it needed to go. My uncle pulled my dad back, and my mom tried to reason with me, but I wasn't budging. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into doing what they wanted. As they were leaving, my dad threw a wad of cash onto my table, saying that I could contact him if I needed more. It was the most disrespectful thing he could have done, and that's when I decided I needed to take things to the next level. I was done playing nice. The next day, I contacted my lawyer. I told him everything, from the vandalism to my parents' threats to the incident with the cash. We decided it was time to file for a restraining order against my family. They'd crossed too many lines, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it anymore. It was time to stand up for myself, and this time I wasn't going to back down. After my parents left my house, tossing cash at me like that was going to fix everything, I realized just how far I was willing to go to protect myself. This wasn't just about Ethan vandalizing my car anymore. It was about my parents, their complete lack of accountability, and how they thought they could control me by throwing their weight around. So I filed for a restraining order. It was time to make things official and cut them out of my life for good. I talked to my lawyer the next morning and explained everything that had happened. He wasn't surprised that my family had escalated things to this point. We had already gathered plenty of evidence, from the social media post to the security footage, and I was confident that we could make a solid case for a restraining order. The vandalism, the threats of a lawsuit, and my dad's aggressive behavior when he was in my house. It all painted a clear picture of why I needed to protect myself. While the legal process began, I started hearing more and more rumors about Ethan. Some old friends from high school reached out to me after seeing the post and shared what they knew. Apparently, Ethan had been getting into a lot more trouble than I had initially realized. He wasn't just unemployed and coasting off my parents anymore. He had allegedly become involved in some pretty shady activities, including dealing drugs. And not just the low-level stuff. He was dealing hard drugs, mostly to wealthy clients who could afford his services. It explained so much. The money he had been offering me to take down the post? That wasn't coming from some honest hustle. He had found a way to make money by doing illegal things, and it didn't surprise me at all. Ethan had never been the type to work hard or earn things legitimately. He always found shortcuts, and this was just the latest in a long line of bad decisions. I had no solid proof yet, but with everything I'd been hearing, it was clear to me that he had gone down a very dark path. What made me even angrier was the fact that my parents had probably known all along. There was no way they didn't realize what Ethan was up to, but instead of trying to stop him or get him help, they continued covering for him. It had been their pattern for years, shield Ethan from the consequences, no matter what. And now, with the drug-dealing rumors flying around, I was even more determined not to take the post down. Ethan needed to be held accountable, not just for vandalizing my car, but for everything else he had been doing behind the scenes. The day of our court hearing for the restraining order finally arrived. I was nervous, but I knew I had done the right thing. My lawyer had prepped me for what to expect, and I felt ready. My parents and Ethan showed up, of course, and I could tell by the looks on their faces that they weren't happy to be there. They still thought they could intimidate me into backing down, but this time was different. I wasn't the same girl who had spent years trying to earn their approval. I had built a life on my own without them, and I wasn't about to let them bully me into submission. In court, my lawyer laid everything out. We presented the security footage, the text messages, and the details of the incident where my dad had punched a hole in my wall. My parents tried to paint a different picture, saying that I was the one who had pushed them away and that they had been trying to reconcile with me for years. But their argument didn't hold up. The facts were on my side, and after everything Ethan had done, it was clear that I was in the right. The judge granted the restraining order. My parents and Ethan were legally required to stay away from me, and they couldn't contact me in any way. It was a small victory, but it felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I had set a boundary that my family couldn't cross. Of course, that didn't stop Ethan from trying. A few days after the hearing, he started texting me again from a different number, begging me to reconsider and take down the post. He even tried to guilt-trip me by saying that our parents were struggling because of all the attention the post had gotten. But I didn't feel bad for them. They had created this mess by enabling Ethan for years, and now they were finally facing the consequences of their actions. I didn't respond to his messages. I had nothing to say to him, and besides, I was already working on the next step, filing a lawsuit of my own. After what happened with the vandalism, the threats, and my dad's violent outburst, I knew I needed to take legal action to protect myself further. My lawyer agreed. We had plenty of evidence to build a case, and I was ready to make sure my family was held accountable for everything they had done. In the meantime, I started hearing from more and more people who had known Ethan growing up. They weren't surprised by how things had turned out for him. Everyone seemed to have a story about how Ethan had always gotten away with bad behavior and how my parents had always bailed him out. It was validating to know that I wasn't the only one who saw through the Golden Child Act. But it was also infuriating to realize how long this had been going on. Despite everything, my parents still hadn't cut Ethan off. After the court hearing, they were spotted together multiple times, acting like nothing had happened. It was clear to me that they were still in denial about who Ethan had become. They couldn't see that by protecting him all these years, they had enabled his downfall, and now they were paying the price for it. I had no regrets about how I had handled the situation. Posting that video had been the right move, and I wasn't going to take it down no matter how much they begged or threatened me. I was done being the family scapegoat, and I was done letting them walk all over me. As the legal proceedings continued, I started to feel a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. For so long, I had carried the weight of my family's dysfunction, but now I was finally letting it go. I didn't need their approval, and I didn't need their validation. I had built a life for myself, and I was proud of what I had accomplished. The lawsuit was going to take time, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. But I wasn't afraid. I had the truth on my side, and I had finally found my voice. My parents and Ethan had tried to silence me for years, but now I was the one in control. And I wasn't going to let them take that away from me. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from their expectations, free from their manipulation, and free from the burden of trying to be the daughter they never appreciated. I had made it on my own, and I was finally standing up for myself. And I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. After the restraining order was granted, I thought things would settle down. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had real distance from the chaos that had been my family. Ethan and my parents could no longer barge into my life whenever they pleased, and that brought a deep sense of relief. But the aftermath of everything wasn't as quiet as I had hoped. A few days later, I got word from one of our old family friends that Ethan wasn't just lying low after the restraining order. He was spiraling. More rumors about his illegal activities were starting to surface. Apparently, people in his circle had caught wind of the drama with my social media post, and now his shady business dealings were under scrutiny. I wasn't surprised. I knew my post had stirred up more than just family tensions. The spotlight I had put on him had done some real damage. It didn't take long for the law to catch up with Ethan. Word spread that he had been arrested in connection with drug-related charges. While I didn't have all the details, it seemed like his little side hustle had finally caught up to him. This was a mess entirely of his own making, and even though I hadn't directly been involved in his downfall, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. For years he had gotten away with everything, skating by because of our parents' protection. But not anymore. This time the consequences were real, and there was nothing my dad could do to make it go away. As for my parents, the fallout from the whole situation hit them harder than I expected. Their reputation, which they had guarded so carefully, was in shambles. Family friends, co-workers, even distant relatives, everyone knew what had happened, and people started pulling away from them. My dad's years of shielding Ethan from the consequences of his actions were finally coming back to bite him. And my mom, who had always tried to play peacemaker, was caught in the middle. A few weeks after Ethan's arrest, my parents tried to reach out to me one last time. My mom sent me a long, emotional email begging for us to put the past behind us. She talked about how much they missed me and how they wanted to start fresh and rebuild our relationship, but I wasn't moved. The email felt like another attempt to sweep everything under the rug, to pretend like the years of favoritism and enabling hadn't happened. They didn't want to face the truth. They just wanted to go back to the way things were, with Ethan at the center of their world and me on the sidelines. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had already made my peace with the fact that I was done with them. The restraining order was still in place, and I wasn't about to let them back into my life just because things had gotten tough for them. They had chosen their path, and now they were facing the consequences. It took me a while to fully process everything that had happened. Cutting ties with my family wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wondered if I had made the right choice. But then I'd remind myself of all the years of neglect, the countless times my achievements had been overshadowed by Ethan's antics, the way my parents had never really seen me for who I was. This wasn't just about the vandalism or the post. It was about years of being treated like I didn't matter. As time went on, I found myself healing in ways I hadn't expected. Without the constant drama of my family, I was able to focus more on my business, my friends, and my own happiness. I stopped worrying about what they thought of me, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Free from their judgment, free from the need for their approval, and free from the toxic dynamic that had ruled my life for so long. The lawsuit I had filed against them was still ongoing, but I wasn't in a rush for it to be over. I knew that no matter what happened in court, I had already won in the ways that mattered most. I had stood up for myself, I had refused to let them push me around anymore, and I had built a life that I was proud of, without their help or their validation. As the months passed, I heard less and less about my parents and Ethan. They had faded into the background like ghosts from a past life that no longer haunted me. The silence was comforting, and with every passing day, I felt more and more at peace with my decision to cut them out. I still had moments of reflection, of course. Sometimes I'd wonder what my life would have been like if things had been different. If my parents had treated me with the same love and attention they gave Ethan. If my brother had been capable of change. But those thoughts were fleeting. I knew that I couldn't change the past, and I didn't need to. The future was mine to shape, and I was determined to live it on my own terms. The most surprising thing, though, was the support I received from people I hadn't expected to hear from. Old friends, colleagues, and even distant family members reached out to tell me how proud they were of me for standing my ground. Some of them had known what my family dynamic had been like for years, but they had never felt comfortable saying anything. Now they were offering their support, and it meant more to me than I could have imagined. In the end, the decision to cut ties with my family wasn't just about them. It was about reclaiming my own life. It was about refusing to be a victim of their dysfunction any longer and taking control of my own happiness. And while it wasn't always easy, it was the best decision I had ever made. As for Ethan, I haven't heard from him since his arrest. I assume he's still dealing with the legal consequences of his actions, but I've made a point not to get involved. Whatever happens to him now is out of my hands, and I'm okay with that. He made his choices, just like I made mine. Looking back, I realized that everything that happened, as painful as it was, needed to happen. I needed to break free from the toxic environment I'd grown up in, and I needed to learn how to stand up for myself. The path to freedom wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Now I'm living the life I always dreamed of, successful, independent, and free from the chains of my past. I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about respect, love, and mutual support. And while my biological family may have failed me in those areas, I've found my own version of family in the people who truly care about me. I've moved on, and I'm happier than I've ever been. My story with Ethan and my parents may have ended, but my life is just beginning. And for the first time, I'm in control of it.